Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second part of the lecture series, Political Economy of Development in Independent India by Professor Venkatesh Athreya. We would like to thank everyone who joined us in the first lecture. We had a very interesting session. And for those who were not able to join in, I'd just like to inform that the lecture is on our YouTube channel, so please do check out. And I would just make one more announcement before moving on to the program. Because of the broad nature of the topic that we are covering, we've sort of decided to keep this three-part lecture into a four-part lecture. So we will have one more session after the third, which is on the 6th. So we'll have the next weekend also one more lecture uh, in the same mode. So I'd just like to inform that. And without any further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Athreya to the floor screen this time. So yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Am I clear? Am I audible?
You are, sir. You are.
Okay, yeah. Let me first of all thank all our participants from last time for their patient listening and for some very good questions at the end. One of the problems with this format and the time limit we have is that one can't do justice to the questions when responding. However, this is not the only form of interaction, and there's a lot of material that I would hopefully be able to send across to the PSF for you to read later on, and then we can always keep interacting every now and then. Today, I thought what I'd do is cover the period. Essentially, we have three lectures now ahead of us, thanks to the announcement that Gautam just made. So we could take some time to go over the parts which I did not cover extensively last time, but we also need to go on to cover the period that comes after the reforms began in 1991, right up to the time of the ascent to office at the center of the BJP led by Mr. Narendra Modi, which is 2014. So maybe we will try and cover as much of this 1980 to 2014 as possible in today's lecture, but definitely we'll complete it by the time we get to the third lecture, and hopefully a part of the third lecture at least will be available for the discussion of the last 7 years of the Indian economy, which have been momentous years, serious setbacks and so on. And of course, there are also global issues that come in, and I'm not sure how much justice we can do to the complexity of all these issues, but we'll make an effort. Now, to come back to the story from last time, essentially what I'm giving you in 4 installments is the not the usual India growth story that you get from the pink press, but in a sense the India growth story is looked at from the point of view of classes, class-based analysis of the nature of growth in the Indian economy. You must also remember at all times that India is something of an abstraction, and that the story I'm conveying applies in a general sense to India as a whole, but there are many parts of India which have distinctly different trajectories from one another, and also naturally from the overall narrative that you are getting from me. I mean, obviously you can't compare Kerala with Pinarayi Vijayan as chief minister with UP where Ajay Singh Pest is the chief minister. So vastly different states, and more does not need to be said. So obviously there are, not just state level variations, even within a state there are significant variations, but obviously we need to abstract, we need to talk about India as a whole to make some sense of what's been happening. So I will do that, fully conscious that whatever I am saying does not necessarily apply across all time and space, even in the period we're talking about. Okay, now we had made the point last time that immediately after independence, the international context was relatively favorable for a newly independent, large developing country like India to make some attempt at a relatively autonomous capitalist development. which is what India did try to do and did succeed to some extent in that process. This entailed a significant role for the state as the leading development agent, and the state's instrumentalities included a kind of planned economy within the framework of an economy dominated by private ownership of the means of production, but some extent of state planning and the emergence of a strong public sector in the advanced industrial parts of the economy. State also had to do much more. It had to worry about health, education, and many other things, setting up institutions, financial sector, infrastructure. So all of which we had, talked about last time. But we also said that yes, there were three important drivers of growth in the period we're talking about, and they were particularly in evidence during the first 15 years from 50 to 66. And we had mentioned them: public investment, import substitution, and limited land reforms. We have covered this ground. Then we had talked about, and we said this represents a break historically with the colonial period. So anyone who says that independence doesn't mean a thing is wrong. It may not mean everything we want it to mean, but it certainly did imply a break with the colonial past to some extent in terms of the tempo of economic development, but not necessarily, an overcoming of all the barriers and prejudices of the colonial period, some of which stay with us even today. But nonetheless, this is a distinctly new phase of Indian development post-independence, and the ultra-left in this country unfortunately failed to recognize them. But we had also pointed out that although the first three planned periods, from 1950-51 to 51-65-66, saw significantly faster growth rate of overall GDP as well as sectoral GDPs, agriculture, industry, services. I didn't go one by one, I didn't go into all details there. And it did represent a break with the colonial stagnation. This path of development at roughly about 4% per annum GDP growth rate compound, roughly about 3% plus of agricultural growth rate compound again, and a significant 8% per annum compound growth rate of industry. All this contrasted favorably with the period from 1900 to 1950. Nonetheless, this growth was internally contradictory. It was not likely to be sustained. And while some proximate events that occurred in the political sphere and in other spheres, such as the India-China border war of 62 and the India-Pakistan conflict of 65-66, while these may have precipitated some aspects of the crisis that followed in 65-66, also contributed to by the two successive droughts we had, which had impacted significantly on food grain output and put us in a very difficult position vis-a-vis our food grain requirements, forcing us to import large amounts of food grain from the US on terms that would entail political dependence of some sort. And this is one of the triggers for hastening the already decided upon strategy of green revolution in the mid-60s. So, but we did say, however, that yes, changes that were there in the post-independence period, setting up public industries, state coming in, putting up infrastructure in finance, in education, healthcare, also creating a number of institutions, some of which are being undermined now in the current period, but also at the same time creating some protection for Indian large industry in the domestic market by import controls and import regulations of various kinds. And of course, we didn't ban imports. We had operated with tariffs, higher rates of duty on imported goods to enable domestic competition. But in some cases, even outright ban was implemented. This created a domestic market for Indian capital, which didn't exist before independence. Public sector investment created an expanding market for the private sector, both as suppliers to the public sector and in terms of the purchasing power of the large numbers employed by the public sector, the expenditure that was incurred in building offsites and civil, infrastructure, buildings, etc., and land reforms, which also unleashed to some extent productive forces in the countryside, as against landlord-dominated, completely stagnant agriculture. We had some movement in agriculture, not a very profound movement, but certainly some rise in productivity per acre, primarily brought about by expanded irrigation, significant increase in area cultivated, all of which contributed to a growth rate of food grains output, which is in excess of the growth rate of population. But at the end of at the half, most of the way through our lecture, we said that this particular path of development, which seemed quite impressive till the mid 1960s, ran into serious problems in the mid 60s, and we had very, very quickly talked about it. We talked about three aspects of the crisis that hit the Indian economy in the mid 60s, all linked to the nature of the economic regime that we had, where the state had to play a contradictory role. It had to play a role of mobilizing resources for building infrastructure, and through that making intermediate inputs available at subsidized prices to the private sector. And at the same time, it had to use the state as an instrument to transfer resources to big capital. Because after all, ultimately the state was functioning in the interests of big capital and big landlords. So it was a landlord capitalist state. All sections of the capitalist class benefited to some extent or the other, but the bigger ones dominated, the big capitalists dominated the state apparatus in India, and then, and they still do now. The composition of these big capitalists may have marginally changed, but their hold over the state apparatus has, if anything, become stronger now, especially with landlords also turning into capitalist landlords for the most part, and the countryside now having many more big capitalist farmers than capitalist landlords than was the case in 1950. So obviously we have moved decisively in a capitalist direction, and landlord capitalism as well as peasant capitalism both have prospered in India, and there's been much greater penetration of capitalism in the countryside in the last 60 odd years. Now that's something getting ahead of our story. Coming back to the mid 60s, why couldn't this show go on? It had to do with the fact, as I said, of the three elements of the crisis. One, that the path of development had as its central requirement continuous public investment, sustaining levels of public investment, which would require mobilizing resources. But that proved very difficult because the state was also simultaneously acting in the interest of the capitalist class and seeking to provide inputs to the capitalist class at subsidized prices, which meant that the public sector surpluses would not be a very significant source of accumulation for the state. They did provide some resources for accumulation, no doubt about it, but they could not provide as much as they would have otherwise done in a differently, enabled state. Therefore, there was a domestic resources crisis that the state could not mobilize resources to sustain public investment, primarily because of the nature of the political economy of the regime, which was unwilling to tax the rich sections who benefited from the path of development. So, of the three sources of revenue open to the government, taxation, public sector surpluses, and charges levied for services provided by the state, none of them were elastic enough for the state to continue to sustain public investments at those levels. So we actually ended up with a fairly severe deficit in the budget, which you might have said in those days one could have printed money, but the problem there was there's something of an inflation barrier that in the 15-16 years of development, significant portions of the working class had come to towns. They were organized, they were politically aware, and a sharp inflationary process set in motion by large deficit and creation of demand not matched by immediate supply, given the constraints in the agrarian economy, would have meant severe inflation. We had some inflation nonetheless, but this could have been so severe, it was felt politically, that the choice was not there for India to run larger and larger deficits of the budget. Instead, the option chosen by the ruling classes was to cut back on public investment in the face of the resources crisis. This is number one. We mentioned this last time also. Second, the Forex crisis, which came from relatively stagnant exports as against rapidly rising imports. Since India had a higher growth rate now, and our import substitution strategy was not end to end, and therefore did not lower the import intensity of production in India. Therefore, India grew faster, we ended up importing more and more. And this is not matched by adequate expansion of exports for reasons that I've discussed last time. The large number of newly independent countries, all pushing out very similar products, agriculture-based products, primary light industrial goods, resulting in a movement in terms of trade unfavorable to the developing countries and favorable to the handful of advanced countries and their big multinational business entities. Always remember that all the discussion we talk about India is taking place in the context of a globe which is characterized by what some Aramean keeps calling the great monopolies: monopoly of technology, monopoly of finance, monopoly of media, you can say, and monopoly of international markets, all of which resides with a relatively small number of advanced country business entities under very powerful states which back them. So the developing countries are always on a bad wicket, on an unequal wicket, and this international inequality, structural inequality of the international economic system must never be forgotten, which of course they don't even have any presence in the standard theories of trade that you're taught in your graduate school, but the real world is rather different, and we have the challenge of dealing with extreme inequality in international economic relations. And that's something I'm not obviously going to discuss in this course, but something to keep in mind, not lose sight of. Anyway, so the problem with the balance of payments arises from rising imports, but not export growing fast enough. You could have, in the context of a world like today's, you could have said, all right, we run a balance of payment deficit, we get attract foreign capital, but from the 50s to the practically till the 70s end, foreign capital from the metropolitan world of the advanced capitalist countries was not willing to move to countries like India in any large amount. They were all preoccupied with first European reconstruction. If you go to the name of the World Bank, originally it is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, and the reconstruction there refers to the reconstruction of what devastated Europe, not of you and India and other tiny, unimportant countries of the West at that time. So they had their hands full. There was not much outflow of investment from the advanced capitalist countries. Mostly there was investment among the metropolitan countries, movement of capital across borders among the metropolitan countries, and of course in some countries of white settlement like New Zealand and Australia, and to some extent in countries which are on the front line of the Cold War like South Korea, Taiwan, but again not a great deal. So, for countries like India, there was really no choice. You had to basically finance your imports through your exports, and otherwise you would borrow, and you didn't really have an option of borrowing much. So when we got to the mid 60s and we had this severe crisis, we were running a large deficit in the balance of payments. There was pressure on the rupee, and when we needed forex very badly, we went to the IMF, and the IMF, as I said last time, directed us to devalue the rupee. So all that I have covered last time. Now the question that I thought I'd briefly expand upon, since there are many non-economists in the audience as well, is why does IMF recommend devaluation? Is that a good strategy for a country facing a balance of payments deficit? What are the assumptions that underlie this kind of recommendation? First, I think the notion is that if a country devalues its currency, then its exports become cheaper in terms of foreign currencies. So if India, for example, were to say that we will now have, we have got there. I mean, suppose in 1966 we had said a dollar will be not 480 anymore, but 10 rupees from tomorrow, twice, which means a dollar will go twice the distance the next day. So which means a quote cost 100 rupees in Indian terms. It will cost $20 earlier, now it costs only $10. So the presumption is that as the export commodity from your country becomes cheaper in foreign currency terms, foreigners will buy more of it. You can imagine all the Americans rushing out to the shops to buy coats. Not a very likely story. Given the nature of the commodities we're exporting, which are income inelastic for the most part, a lowering of its price would not have dramatically increased the purchase of those commodities. It would have still been a net loss of forex revenue for us if we had lowered, as we did lower prices, exchange rates dramatically. But the story about the devaluation mechanism is really not about the balance of payments. It's about actually, one would argue, some people would argue that why do I say devaluation may not work for you? First of all, remember that there are 100 countries competing with India. They wouldn't be idle if you devalued. They wouldn't keep quiet because they're competing with you. So they'll find some other way of either subsidizing their exports or devaluing themselves. Second, first of all, the nature of your exports should be such as to induce proportionately more buying because of a lowering of price. What we call, price elasticity demand greater than one in economics terms. But India's exports were not like that. So just lowering the price would not automatically entirely increase demand and therefore increase forex revenues. Second, competition from other countries would come in. And third, many of your exports themselves were based on imported raw materials. So that would also be a complication. But nonetheless, devaluation has one very clear effect, which is that it sharply increases the cost of living. Because India is importing, even in the mid-60s, significant amounts of crude oil and so on. So when those prices in dollar terms now become much higher in rupee terms, you're generating inflation through the entire economy. And so it would have cut into the real incomes of working people. Now, the cynic might say that this is why the capitalist class, whenever it is unable to drive money wages down, prefers to operate through inflation, and devaluation is one good way to stoke inflation. So some inflation is in the interest of the capitalist class and against the interests of fixed income earners and the peasantry and so on. Anyway, again, I don't want to get too much into economics, but in the event, against much criticism, Mrs. Gandhi did go to IMF and we devalued the rupee, but consequences were exactly as we had suggested, a sharp rise in prices following devaluation, and this added to the already sharp rise in prices arising from two successive drought years. So essentially, we ended up with a lot more, problems, especially with inflation, and all of this got reflected in the '67 elections that I mentioned last time. So, in a sense, the response to balance of payments crisis was not very productive. The only area where the state succeeded to some extent was the response to the food grain crisis, where again, it had an interesting effect. You see, the food grain crisis led to a shift in government policy, which said that let's not worry about land reforms. Let's try and get output of food grains increased as quickly as possible, which means we need to push a strategy, which came to be called betting on the strong, of providing subsidized inputs in irrigation and power and so on for the well-to-do farmers, ensure that we'll take the produce at prices that are affordable to them. And once they employ these new techniques that just come on board just then, the high-yielding variety seeds and the so-called green revolution technology, as it's often called misleadingly. Then once we do that, then the progressive farmers will show the way, others will follow suit, and so on. This is the thinking. So the idea was to move away from land reforms and other institutional changes of a progressive kind, and put all your faith in the new green revolution strategy. Now, there is a lot of, you know, ignorant and uninformed criticism of the Green Revolution around us now. So it's important to dispel some of those myths. What we must understand is that what is now being called Green Revolution is many things. It means many things to many people. What we used to talk about was the so-called new strategy in agriculture. That's what it used to be called in economics. And what that was about a whole package which involved high-yielding variety seeds, fertilizers and pesticides and other chemical inputs, mechanization via mechanization of harvesting and other agricultural operations, all of which would help maybe squeeze in one more crop in a two-crop season or second crop in a one-crop season, one-crop annual system. So the idea was the biological part, high-yielding variety seeds, the chemical part, fertilizers and so on, and then the mechanical part. All together would actually contribute to higher output per acre and to more crops per unit of land over a year, more intense cultivation and higher output per acre. And in the event this did happen, by the way, to those who think the Green Revolution made no improvement in food grains output, they're just completely off the wall, they're completely wrong. But we must emphasize that this is not such a green revolution that technology was a thing. No, the state played a very central role in this, and I need to spell out some of those steps. One, it is experience of the peasantry experience is that whenever they increase output, they will have to face a decline in price they get in the market. Now, in the case of the new agricultural strategy, one of the components was procurement. So the state said, we set up the Food Corporation of India and we said we will procure grain from the farmers, open-ended procurement at a price that would be remunerative for the farmers. So public procurement at reasonable prices, guaranteeing some minimum profitability for the farmer, all those principles that are being given the go-by right now, they were seen as necessary then to enthuse farmers and to increase food grains output, which was seen as very critical to ensuring India's sovereignty. Because remember, the issue about food grain supplies had a link to the Indian leadership of the non-aligned movement and the US response to our criticism of their involvement in Vietnam, their aggression in Vietnam. So there was a economic sovereignty angle. Food security was critical for economic sovereignty, so we had to increase food grain output very quickly. At that time, the Western world wrote all sorts of nonsense. People like the couple, the population bomb couple, Ehrlichs, said India would be a basket case and there'd be no, people won't be able to get fed. Of course, we continue to have chronic hunger in this country. Of course, the levels of food consumption of the majority of the population is still way below what it should be in terms of nutritional requirements. But there's no denying the fact that the strategy that we adopted in the mid-60s helped increase food grain output significantly, both absolutely and in terms of output per acre, so that we now have a much larger population, but we have a higher per capita food grain output. At least we used to have until the new economic reforms came up in the 1990s. But for a while, we did manage to get food grain output to grow faster because of the new strategy for agriculture. Remember also that it was not just procurement, it was not just technology, but it was also, you bring in a new method of cultivation to a largely semi-literate or non-literate population. You need a lot of hand-holding to it. So we had to build an extension system, to build a national research system of agriculture. So considerable investments have been made in national research system and national extension system for agriculture, which of course the state came in a big way to do. But we are not done yet with the role of the state in the Green Revolution, so-called. Guaranteeing purchase at procurement prices, providing extension and research services, but equally important was to provide credit because the new method of cultivation required purchase of inputs which means cash needs grew much greater. So you had to ensure that farmers had access to cash, to credit of some kind. So we had to expand lending to agriculture. We had to expand institutional lending so that farmers won't get caught in very unfavorable terms of borrowing. Of course, in the event, many of them did. But at least, perhaps the most significant measure the state took in this regard was the nationalization of banking in 1969 on the 19th of July. It's ironic because that week, media were highlighting the 30 years of reform, 1991, July 24th, Manmohan Singh's, big budget and all that. But the real big event was actually the National Bank's July 1969, because this, for the first time, with the private sector banks being nationalized and the state being able to determine credit priorities, we moved from commercial banking to social development banking. And agriculture and small industry received a lot more credit than they ever had from the private sector dominated banking system. Today we are reversing that and going back to a private sector dominated banking system with presumable consequences for agriculture. But at that time, 14 banks being nationalized in 69 July, another 6 banks in 1980. It is quite possible that political motives were there behind Mrs. Gandhi's decision to nationalize banks, but the objective consequences of bank nationalization are very important. Let me give you only one figure, which I may have mentioned last time, I'm not sure, which is that with bank nationalization and significant promotion of rural banking, branch banking in the countryside, we had this phenomenal transformation between 1969 and 1991. In 1969, we had a population of around 53 crores, but we had one bank branch per 65,000 population. In other words, in a panchayat union, there will be only one bank branch, just one bank branch, mind you. But in 1991, before the reforms, the new reforms came, before the neoliberal reforms came, we had the population increased to about 85 crores, so about 60% increase. But population per bank branch had actually come down to 15,000. The phenomenal expansion of rural branch banking, which took banking to the sections which are grossly underserved earlier, like small producers, artisans, small and tiny industries and medium businessmen, and most importantly, small and marginal farmers as much as the larger farmers, and to some extent as larger farmers. Of course, given that credit is always based on area owned and operated, obviously the rich will get more credit than the poor. But at least the poor were able to access some form of credit, which made a huge difference in their lives. And I think all these aspects need to be kept in mind, because there's a lot of ecological romanticism in our midst, which tends to dismiss the Green Revolution, make all sorts of fantastic claims against it. I think in class terms, it is clearly, much more favorable to the rich than to the poor. That's what you expect in an economic system like ours. It had many limitations, were confined initially, at least for a couple of decades, confined to just rice and wheat. It depended crucially on assured and stable irrigation, all of which limited its reach across the cultivating population, no doubt. So it was a source of inequality. But in absolute terms, it did help increase food grains output significantly. So from roughly about 50 to 55 million tons of food grains in the 50s, we are now somewhere around 300 plus million tons per year in this country. And, all your organic farming wallahs and ecological romanticists cannot tell you that we could have done this 300 million tons without new technology or without other initiatives that the state took. But remember, it was a state-led transformation, not a market-led transformation. And that is the important point, that once the state began withdrawing support to agriculture in the 90s, you had massive consequences, negative consequences for agriculture, which we'll discuss later. But I want to just remind you that yes, the state response to the third of the three elements of the crisis was somewhat more successful than the other elements of the crisis that they had, uh, the way they had responded was unsuccessful. Okay, so I think we have taken good bit of time talking about this, about half an hour, but I think it's worth it. I think it's important for you to know what was the Green Revolution all about. Remember, it is still, has many sides to it. For example, in the beginning, the Green Revolution resulted in increased employment because first of all, it raised yields, so more employment in harvesting and threshing, but also because it promoted intensive cultivation, more area under irrigation, and so there was an expanded degree of employment. But later, as mechanization came in a big way, the employment potential of the Green Revolution became negative. It was not positive. In the beginning, it was positive, and so there will be some uh, truth to the argument that even the small farmers and the landless benefited from the Green Revolution in its initial stages in areas where these crops were being grown and where there was assured irrigation. Always remember that caveat. It didn't help much for the dry regions, it didn't help much for other crops, which were not looked into at that point in time. But for those growing wheat or paddy, and to go from this to the statement that Green Revolution only provided starch but nothing else, this is rubbish. I mean, this is just failing to understand what is the context that we are discussing the whole issue in. So one has to be careful in critically analyzing the Green Revolution. I have serious criticisms of it in terms of even the fact of whatever negative ecological consequences might have been there cannot be discussed in isolation from the failure to provide effective extension services. So the role of the state becomes very important, and what the inadequacies in the role of the state should not then become reasons to blame technological change or modernization itself, as some people do. Of course, when modernization is capitalist modernization, it will have capitalist characteristics. Why would you be surprised? But nonetheless, application of science and technology to agriculture is critical, and it's essential if we have to solve problems today that the country and humanity faces. So I think it's very important not to cultivate a negative attitude to new technology in agriculture. One can discuss the consequences of different classes, the entire gamut of state policies are responsible for what's different population. Not determinative. So the policies that determine who gets what. So fighting, getting angry with technology is not a useful, you know, kind of reaction to the progress of science and technology. Okay, anyway, I know the general issues, but nonetheless, it's not like Green Revolution led to a uniform and smooth increase in output. It did not. There were several years in the 70s where you had a problem. There were droughts. There was greater variation in levels of output. But overall, over time, the new agricultural strategy did result in a rate of growth of food grain output, which was much higher than the rate of the population, at least until about 1991, until the mid 90s, I would say. Um, it began to slow down with the advent of the reforms and with the decline of public and private investment in agriculture. But at least until 91, it was on an upward curve, and per capita food grain output and availability in India kept growing in that period. So one must not dismiss that period as, either the cause of our problems today or as being irrelevant. No, it's a very important, relevant period. It is a very good exemplar of how purposive planned state action can make a big positive difference, despite the class character of the state. That's the interesting thing about the Green Revolution. Yeah, obviously it benefited the landlords and richer sections more. Obviously, the fertilizer companies made their money, but none of this would be an argument for saying we shouldn't have had the Green Revolution. Okay. Anyway, that's something that I wanted to speak in some detail about. I couldn't do last time. However, we're going to turn to different things now, which I hadn't discussed last time, vis-a-vis the second phase, before we move on to the 80s. And we should do that quickly because I have quite a bit to have to say on the 80s. Um, I had mentioned that Mrs. Gandhi left led the Indian National Congress after the death of Lal Bahadur Shastri. But in the 67 elections, following increase in unemployment from cutbacks in public investment and so on, Congress lost elections in 8th Assembly. We discussed this briefly last time. So Mrs. Gandhi was running a minority government for some time. The Bank Nationalization Act itself became possible only because of the support offered by the left, by the CPI and CPIM. CPI was with the Congress politically, CPIM was not. But CPIM nonetheless supported bank nationalization. And by 71, it was clear, following Bangladesh, the war that led to the creation of Bangladesh between India and Pakistan, Mrs. Gandhi was her political, capital was very high, and so she took the opportunity to prepone the elections that were due in 72, and came back with a big majority, and the Congress also got a big majority. Of course, she made pacts in different states. India is a very complicated country, so. But even in 67, the one important outcome of the election of that year was that at least there were two states where left-led governments could come in, Kerala and West Bengal. If you go back to that period in history, and these were very different as well. Um, Again, we have no time to go into all the political implications of this, but just merely to say that to have so many non-Congress governments was a significant dent on the then already growing authoritarian role of the Congress. But if you look at the current times, you would think that was democracy in those days, although the EMS government got dismissed for no reason at all. Nonetheless, obviously compared to the Modi era, everything else looks more democratic. So anyway, there we are. So the second thing in the 70s was that we had this after 71 victory, Mrs. Gandhi felt secure enough and pushed very hard with her policies, which were early indicators of economic liberalization, including the passing of the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act in 1973. We moved to the emergency in 75. Again, I don't have time to discuss the emergency in a great depth. It's a political issue that needs much more discussion. But it did seem to be a period where Mrs. Gandhi was now experimenting with more liberalized policies. It's not new either, because in 65, 66, when we ran into a crisis, and ultimately Mrs. Gandhi settled for this devaluation and all that, at that time also there was a lot of talk in the air about Bechtel Corporation coming in, setting up fertilizer plants here, American investment coming in here. India, especially in the wake of the India-China border war, India is getting drawn towards a closer relationship with the US, and Mrs. Gandhi was not averse to the idea of US investment in India in a big way. So, in that sense, the Indian capitalist class, point I keep making, does not have too many qualms. I mean, it may take an anti-imperialist position, and it's a matter of survival and its own class interests, ultimately important the Indian big bourgeoisie. And so in the mid-60s, there was some move. Ultimately, they didn't succeed because the Bechtel Corporation set terms that no self-respecting government could have accepted. So we didn't go for those, allowing Bechtel to control distribution and pricing of fertilizers at a time when we needed control over fertilizer prices for implementing the Green Revolution. I'm saying this only to remind you that that don't have ironclad visions of what each leader was like. They were all pretty flexible in terms of the class interest that they were serving. So in the early 70s, again, there was a move to the right. The emergency came. As I said, we can't discuss it here today, but the authoritarian regime was set in place. And during that time, attempts were there to forge closer relations with the US in economic terms. Indo-US Business Council met a few times, but nothing much came of it because Mrs. Gandhi got defeated in the 77 elections. But in the meantime, in all of this, what had steadily declined was planning. In the wake of the crisis in 66, we suspended planning for 3 years, but only annual plans, 66, 67, 67, 68, 68, 69. Then we had a fourth 5-year plan which came very late, although its period was 69 to 74, and it got a midterm assessment which led to further cutback in its targets. And even the cutback targets were not achieved. And by the time we came to the fifth plan, seriousness of planning was really at a lower ebb. And in 77, when this Janata regime came, they of course said, we have a rolling plan. We don't believe in 5-year plans. We will keep taking stock every year. But they didn't survive. So by 80, Mr. Gandhi was back. Again, I'm not going into the specific details of what happened in this period, except to say that when Mr. Gandhi came back in 80, thanks to the bungling of the Janata government, its internal factionalism and rivalries and all that, and the severe economic events of 79 and 80 of a 21% decline in agricultural output, 18% decline in agricultural output, sharp rise of 21% in prices, and so on. And of course, again, a Forex problem of significant proportions. Mrs. Gandhi came back after having been defeated in both constituencies in 77, came back with a thumping majority in 80. And she proceeded to open up Indian economy slowly. The first act there was the big IMF loan, about which we have all written. So again, I'm not going into details here because we have to move on. But the IMF loan was held in great secrecy, shrouded in secrecy until the then Washington correspondent of the Hindu, Mr. N. Ram, broke it. And this became a topic for discussion. Many of us economists signed a statement against the IMF loan saying you're accepting many harsh conditions, whereas in fact if you looked at what are essential imports, and if you're willing to adopt more stringent import-export fiscal policies, you could actually manage the crisis without having to go to the IMF for a big loan. But no, Mrs. Gandhi was set and they went to the IMF for a big loan. A lot of discussions back and forth. All of this has been written about, interesting enough, by one of the people implicated there in opposing the IMF loan at that time, who was at that time in the left camp, who later on became the media advisor of Mr. Manmohan Singh. Also at that time, someone I knew as a friend. He had taken, Sanjay Baru had also written about the IMF World Bank strategy in Social Scientist, the issue devoted to the IMF loan, where he was castigating them for their attitude to developing countries. So, people change positions in their life, and who said consistency is a great virtue. So, some people decide that they see the world differently now. It's their right to do so. But it's interesting because in that period, 81, when Mrs. Gandhi went in for the IMF loan, the left did a massive campaign across the country against it. And the left front government of West Bengal, whose finance minister was Ashok Mitra, brought out a very important book, IMF Loan Facts and Issues, including the reports of Mr. Ram in the Hindu and many other contributory articles by people like Omeya Bakshi and Prabhat Patnaik and many others. And we all wrote about these things in various journals and spoke on public platforms. But of course, we were not listened to. As it turned out, by 1985, the government of India could claim they are not taking the final loan installment, 84-85 budget. That's what Pranab Mukherjee claimed. But it turned out that they had actually negotiated a loan with the ADB, so they didn't need the last installment of the IMF loan. Again, these are all trivial details that I want to get into now. But the tragic assassination of Mrs. Gandhi in 84 October meant that there was once again an important turning point of crisis, and Rajiv Gandhi became Prime Minister at the end of 1984. The second half of the 80s was in some respects very distinct from the first half of the 80s. It carried forward liberalization at a much greater pace. But liberalization itself started earlier, as I tried to indicate to you, creeping liberalization, but significant liberalization occurred with Rajiv Gandhi coming to office as Prime Minister. Much of this, the reforms, the budget of 1985 and so on, is discussed in a double issue of the Social Scientist, issue number 146, 147, in which Bharat Patnaik and I and others have written. In fact, Sanjay Bharat's article also figures in that particular issue, while we were making our points about the new economic policy of Rajiv Gandhi, and how it was not going to be in the interest of India's working people. Nonetheless, interestingly enough, if you look at 1980 to 90, we must now come back to the debate began in 80 in the shift to policy shifts that occurred in that period. I've gone too much into anecdotes today, so I'm losing some time. So let me pull it back, and because this relates to a question that Gautam raised at the last lecture at the end. We see in 1980, what was happening? Why do I make a 1980 a significant point? Because it was a point of significance because the international economy had changed decisively, or was changing decisively by 1980. So we need to take a short detour to look at that. I had mentioned to you that when India became independent, the West was primarily preoccupied with European reconstruction and so on. But by 1980, the Western ruling classes had stabilized themselves. Finance capital was very much in the saddle. And the large profits made in the long boom of the Western world from the mid-40s to the early mid-70s meant that there was a huge amount of liquidity in the international economy, in the banking system, because corporate profits had zoomed. And this long boom from 45 to 74, 75, the first recession came in 74, 75, 73 you can say. This is actually unexpected. People had expected recessions, and economists had talked about secular stagnation and all that, Keynesians. And yet we had this, a 5% rate of growth compound over a 25, 30-year period was unprecedented in capitalism. But that's what we had from 45 to 73, 74 for a variety of reasons which I can't go into here. But the consequences are important. Consequences are that, first of all, there was a huge amount of accumulation of capital by powerful global capitalist entities. And a lot of that was in the international financial system. Then you had the sharp oil price increase of 73, which I referred to last time, also 78 later. And this put a lot of money again into the international financial system. Thirdly, you had all these workers and employees who had come into the workforce in the period of expansion of the Western economies, post-World War II till about early mid-70s. And all their savings and their retirement provisions like provident funds and so on were all part of the international pool of finance. So there's huge accumulation of finance capital in the international banking system by the time you come to the end of the 70s. And this is really what triggers, especially in the context of the recession of 74, 75 in the West, banks wooing developing countries in Latin America for borrowing because they had money and they had to lend it. And these were governments, the sovereign borrowers, the safe borrowers, we thought. So the huge amount of lending that happened. India wasn't part of this first wave of lending. It came in later in 81. But interestingly, this period from 75 to 85, of which 80 becomes the midpoint, it is interesting because this huge expansion of lending to developing countries that occurs all over Latin America, Central America, and then the first defaults start coming in the early 80s. In an article written in 83 in the English Marxist quarterly journal of the CPIM, Kitty Menon talks about a sharp rise in third world country debt to $1 trillion in a matter of a few years. Now, this whole process of lending to the third world countries, sovereign debt being considered safe, led to a situation where these countries were now caught in the grip of imperialism. And so now, in order to come out of that crisis, they had to accept the conditions imposed by the international lending institutions, primarily the World Bank and the Fund, And that was born the famous and infamous program of structural adjustment. This was happened in the 80s, still ahead, not immediately there happening. But in India, chorus was a different chorus. Saying that, like, what about South Korea? What about Taiwan? These countries are growing faster. And why couldn't India? India's problem was that we decided on an internally oriented, internal market directed strategy. We had import substitution, we had public investment. Instead, we should have gone for an export led strategy of development. Now, the government of India is not so foolish, and they're quite careful in how they formulate their problems, because export led development for a country of India's size would have been quite ludicrous. By the way, China is not a case of export led development either, in case some of you have been told that. The numbers are just too huge. India would have had to grow at a phenomenal rate for export expansion to take care of our employment problems. And the nature of technology would have had to be so employment intensive so as to not make it worthwhile at all. So, what the government of India's own paper talked about was growth-led exports, very cleverly. The Abida Hussain committee talked about growth-led exports. Nevertheless, there was this discussion in around 80 of why can't India, reduce state intervention in the economy, promote the private sector more vigorously, align with the Western world, seek export possibilities, open up the economy, and remove restrictions and regulations. Essentially, the neoliberal push, its antecedents are to be found in the discussion around 1980. Much was made about the fact that despite all these investments and so on, India's rate of growth remained stubbornly low at about 3% or 3.5%. Raj Krishna, in those communally less charged times, even coined a phrase called the Hindu rate of growth. Today he would have been in trouble. He had said that, but at that time the Hindu rate of growth was not to characterize our apparently permanent 3.5% rate of growth, no matter what you did. Some kind of nirvana. This is what he had in mind. But then the argument was: wouldn't you look at Singapore? Wouldn't you look at Hong Kong? Wouldn't you look at Taiwan, South Korea? But this is the so-called Gang of Four that was seen as having done extraordinarily well in terms of growth rates in that period. But of course, Hong Kong and Singapore don't bear comparison. They are city-states. Singapore is a comparison with them would have some relevance. But you see, in this case of both Taiwan and South Korea, and also, in fact, China and Japan, interestingly, the four Asian countries that seem to have successfully managed their modern economic development, conventionally understood, that they all had basic land reforms under different historical circumstances. Japan had to have it because the American forces stayed there from 46 to 51, wanted to ensure that the Japanese landlord didn't re-emerge as a ruling class. So they pushed comprehensive land reforms, serious land reforms in Japan. South Korea likewise had the North Korean land reform to contend with politically. Similarly, Taiwan had to contend with the fact that mainland China had done comprehensive land reforms. So there were historical accidents as to why land reforms occurred in these cases, except the Chinese case where there was a long 30-year peasant revolution where land reform was explicitly predicated as a key objective. But nonetheless, these four countries have this commonality in education and healthcare and so on. Significant investments in education and healthcare as well. Plus, in the case of these three capitalist countries, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, more explicitly so in South Korea and Japan, were frontline states in the Cold War period. So they would get preferential treatment in terms of access to markets and so on. All of these come in. I'm not saying one or the other, but I'm only making the point that South Korea and Taiwan had very different set of constraints and possibility, and India did. So one can't expect India to be able to emulate South Korea, Taiwan. China would have been a more appropriate challenge, but that was, you don't mention China in certain circles, you see. There's so much allergy there that even the ones who wanted to say India should take a leaf from China would have had to say it in a roundabout way. But and I find surprisingly times haven't changed a great deal so many years later. We seem to have a problem with China and its phenomenal achievements. Anyway, that's another story for another day. Coming back to this, so in 80, there was this, at Mr. Gandhi's time itself, there was this talk about, changing strategy, lesser role for the state, going to the IMF loan, accept their policies, and it took further steps in the Rajiv Gandhi period. Yet, for all of this rhetoric of less state involvement, greater liberalization, some of which happened nonetheless, the growth in the 1980s of the Indian economy was quite impressive, but it was not based on state withdrawal at all. On the contrary, it was based on significant state expenditure. India in the 1980s had a rate of growth of around 5.5% per annum compound in the first half, the rate almost 6% per annum in the second half. Overall, the whole period, the growth rate would have been closer to 6% because of the sheer size of the economy at the end of the period. And this is achieved primarily through state borrowing and significantly larger government expenditures, leading to wider state deficits, which are then later felt to be unsustainable. But this is a growth process in the 80s led by government expenditure. Catch was that this growth, government expenditure led growth, is quite impressive. And when I say impressive, mind you, it is in all sectors. Agriculture grew at about 4% plus rates of growth. Industry grew at about 8% per annum, and the service sector grew even faster. In fact, the share of the service sector in the Indian economy, which was 36% in 80, became 39% by the end of the decade. So the service sector grew even faster than the material producing sectors. So all sectors of the economy grew rapidly in the 80s, and they did not grow rapidly because of free market policies. On the contrary, they grew because of much larger government expenditure. Problem was, how was this expenditure financed? Was this a sustainable way of expanding growth? And what was the implication of this kind of growth for your balance of payments? Not just the fiscal problem of government spending promoting growth, but also the question that if this decadal growth of the 80s, remember, was accompanied by significant import liberalization, especially under the Rajiv Gandhi regime. And it was also accompanied by the first major steps of liberalization, delicensing, broadbanding, a whole range of so-called new policies that were announced, all of which were in the direction of deregulating the economy and giving far wider room for large private capital, changing the limits for defining monopoly houses, essentially putting the MRTP Act into cold storage, Monopolies Industry Trade Practices Act into cold storage, giving up all the assumptions that underlay the decision earlier on to regulate industrial growth. The Industrial Growth Development and Regulation Act envisaged both development and regulation, but regulation was now considered undesirable. So we began to move in a liberalized direction in the second half of the 80s under Rajiv Gandhi's regime. Nonetheless, we did not move so fast that we had growth occurring through private initiative alone. No. Growth in the 80s was very much a consequence of large government expenditure, which put money in the hands of people and also in the hands of industry, accompanied by import liberalization. Now, this is all covered very well in a very good book, 2004, 2005, a second edition possibly, by Jayati Ghosh and C.P. Chandrasekhar, The Market That Failed. I've reviewed it in Frontline around that time, which goes to this period and discusses it in great detail. And there's been a lot of writing. If you want to keep track of the Indian economy regularly, the best place to go is MacroScan. It's a site run by our friends in JNU. Now, of course, no longer in JNU, but team at Sansekhar, Jyoti Ghosh, and some other friends. They keep giving you good material on the Indian economy. Anyway, all of that, the essential thing was in the 80s, you achieved rapid economic growth in terms of GDP. This is valid for the private sector, secondary sector, and the tertiary sector. This is also a period of significant rural development expenditure by the state. This is the era of the IRDP, Integrated Rural Development Project, and so on. So, while there was delicensing and privatization and the new education policy, new textile policy, then significant borrowing from abroad in the second half of the 80s, especially from commercial sources. All of that on the one hand, but on the other hand also significant economic growth. So what came? Why did this have to lead to crisis? You see, I mentioned one point here that I already said that this was being financed by government expenditure. And so this government expenditure was occurring, it was not getting financed by taxation. More and more borrowing was being resorted to. So when you borrow, naturally your debts accumulate over time, and India, at the end of the 80s, India had to face a significant problem of internal debt as well. There was some indirect taxation, significant increase in indirect taxation, administered prices, but no efforts to mop up sources on a large scale from big capital. Although VP Singh made some initial efforts, they were not carried forward. And he himself was shifted from, I don't know where he was, to some other ministry and ultimately left the government, becoming a rival and winning an election in 89. That's a different story. But in the period 84 to 89, when 85, 89, when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister, the liberalization process was accelerated in terms of government relying on borrowing, externally and internally. And the external borrowing moving from the earlier IMF kind of borrowing to more short-term commercial borrowing from private sources, which of course meant that you were quoting a BOP crisis. And it came in 1991. A number of unfavorable developments occurred in the international economy. You had the Gulf War, you had earlier the Iran-Iraq War, and which meant the Gulf War is a double whammy. In one sense, the Indians coming back home brought in some forex, but in the long term, your employment opportunities were not there for some time. And then you had to pay much higher prices for oil. And you had liberalized imports, you had moved in agriculture towards an energy intensive strategy with the Green Revolution and more use of mechanization and chemicalization of agriculture. So your import needs were rising sharply. You had not succeeded in expanding domestic production of fertilizers or domestic, to some point, to some extent, the Bombay High kept you in the frame, but that couldn't last forever. What actually saved you to some extent, saved the country to some extent in terms of balance of payments was the remittances from Indian working people abroad. They are the unsung heroes of our economy, being not completely, smashed by Forex crisis. They were always there providing foreign exchange from their remittances, sending money home for children to get educated or whatever, or the family to build a small house. So this is obviously not the Swaraj Pauls and the Malyas and the others. This is basically ordinary working people, artisans, welders, fitters, working people who are living in the Middle East in fairly hostile conditions and still manage to send home all the savings that they could make. And this is a huge, helped India avert very severe balance of payments crisis. But nonetheless, by the end of the 80s, we did have to face up to a significant balance of payments crisis. I'll give you one indicator of the extent to which our external borrowing had expanded in the 80s. Economists use a ratio called the debt service ratio. And what this is take the annual debt related obligations of a country, repayment of part of the capital and payment of interest, amortization and interest charges. Okay, we express that because it has to be done in foreign exchange, can't be given as rupees, it has to be given in dollars or whatever. So you express that figure of what you have to pay by way of installment of principal and interest for the period concerned. Express that as a share of your export value. Gives you some idea of your vulnerability. In 1980, India's debt service ratio, that is to say, the ratio of the value of amortization requirement that India had to meet on its external debt to the value of India's exports, was only 9% in 1980. By the end of the decade, by 1990, it became 33%, huge increase. And in those days, the World Bank used to argue that 20% was safe, but going above 20% was not a good idea. If DSR exceeds 20%, then you are in trouble, you are at risk. But it was 33%. So, in a sense, the Forex crisis we're talking about in 1991 is linked to the strategy of development pursued in the 80s. And yet, you have people like Dr. Manmohan Singh who come and take over as finance minister and talking as if they came from some other planet. They were there as RBI chairperson, as planning commission deputy chairman. Through all this period, RBI governor, planning commission deputy chairman, you're all part of policy establishment in the 80s. And there is some accountability in this country. But you have all these interesting things happening in the 80s and the faithful pro-corporate media lapping it all up. But essentially by 1990, India's external debt obligation had become severe. But remember also that this was as I said earlier, this is the context of some unfavorable international developments, the Gulf crisis, the Iraq war, all of which hurt us very badly. On top of that, in 1991 came the collapse of the Soviet Union and earlier the setbacks in the East European countries. So the world was turning hostile to countries like India, which had been able to utilize the presence of rival economic systems for their own development and for their own bargaining purposes. This was no longer available with the collapse of the USSR and the weakening of and the setback in European socialist countries. Now, this is not the place, we do not have the time to discuss what happened in Eastern Europe, what happened in the USSR. That's not our part of our subject. So we will not get into that. But we will make the point that, look,
So it's
internationally, yeah,
we've just crossed 1 hour, so just wanted to remind you.
1 hour, more than that, I thought. What time is it?
Yeah, 1 hour 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. So I have another 10. I can finish by 8, right? Then we have questions after that. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Right,
maybe
Bob.
another 5 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes.
Okay. All right. Now, basically, then you see what you have is international development become unfavorable. You have a balance of payments crisis staring you in the face. You also have rising internal debt, increasing expenditure by the state, unmatched by any ability, any effort to mobilize resources from the well-to-do. So you have, by 1991, a strong push for India to accept large loan from the IMF and the World Bank. And initially, at least, the government argued. I remember these were years of political uncertainty because we had the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, then Rajiv Gandhi's regime came, but 89, 91, Rajiv Gandhi couldn't win the re-election. So there was a short 10-month-long VP Singh government, which was undone by both Congress and BJP ganging up together. Then the whole, Ram Janmabhoomi, the rise of Hindutva and the right-wing proto-fascist movements. So you have three significant things are happening in the early 90s in India in the context of what was happening globally. One is, of course, head back to socialism, and that what it does to your bargaining power vis-a-vis the Western world, and how it skews you into a more amenable position vis-a-vis imperialism, and also how it, makes you take those kinds of subordinate political positions, potentially. Then there was this question of neoliberal policies across the world and in the wake of the seeming failure of earlier socialist regimes and the entire third world debt crisis, which gave the Western world a handle to shape policies in the Latin American and other parts of the developing world. Uh, then you have this rise of the right-wing Hindutva right-wing in India. So these three developed neoliberal policies, weakening of India's position with the left politically, and then the uh, general rightward shift of political forces. These were the great challenges in 1990, and in a sense, they presaged the uh, economic reforms that happened in 91. Although at that time, not much reference was being made to Hindutva and other elements of the new reality. But he was to add one more point in this mix before I close and open it up for discussion. Uh, that this is a time of great political uncertainty. 89, 91 was an unstable government. Then you had, Congress did not win a majority in 91, by the way. I've written about it in Frontline in an article called A Tale of Two Elections. In fact, in the run-up to period up to Rajiv Gandhi's tragic assassination, Congress was way behind. The assassination of Rajiv Gandhi gave a huge sympathy vote to the Congress, and even then they didn't make a majority. Later on, they managed a majority with the help of some other political parties, precise mechanisms of which are not clear to us. But they did manage a majority later. But when Manmohan Singh started by devaluing the rupee exactly as suggested by a World Bank report of October 1990, and when he started by raising PDS issue prices significantly and fertilizer prices significantly, cutting subsidies to the poor and the farmers, we knew which way the wind was blowing. And so, in a sense, despite the minority status of the government, Manmohan Singh began with the bank with the full, presumably, consent of the Congress leadership. And that is, people have not noticed the irony that none of these reforms figured in the Congress manifesto for the 1991 elections, by the way. But they did win, and they did go ahead and do this. The other important development of the 80s, internationally speaking, which I have not been able to cover here, but which is something that I should just at least mention in passing, and that is the rise of the World Trade Organization. I told you earlier that in the mid-70s, the third world countries could press for a new international economic order at the UN. By the mid-80s, I had mentioned last time, that in 1985, the ninth round of Uruguay negotiations start, 86, if I remember right, in Uruguay. So that's the round that ultimately leads to the formation of the World Trade Organization in 1995, January. So the ninth round was really critical. Punta del Este is the name of the place where the negotiations took place. And this is remarkable because the agenda for the ninth round of trade negotiations under the old GATT was a list of demands made by the advanced countries. They wanted you to open the service sector. They wanted to strengthen the intellectual property laws. They wanted you to admit, liberalize imports and exports, and admit free flow of finance, capital, etc., etc., etc. Open up the entire services sector, open up agriculture, and so on. So it's a complete turnaround. And initially, of course, by 1995, third world countries were numb because they had lost the possibility of bargaining using the socialist camp, the collapse of socialism. They had all become heavily indebted in the second half of the 80s and the early 90s. And then they were now being hit with this WTO. So it took a while for them to regroup. It happened later. It happened later at, also because of other internal contradictions among the northern countries as well. And after 2005, it has been much more in the doldrum. The WTO has been much more in the doldrum. Nonetheless, there's been a decisive right-wing shift in the nature of international economic relations. Much greater power of the Western world and of global monopoly capital to dictate terms. This is the context in which India moves into 1991. But I will talk about the narrative on reforms from the ruling classes next time, not today. And maybe we will. Clearly, all this takes more time than I thought, but we'll stop here since the moderator has told me I used up my time. Okay? Yeah. Gautam. Yeah,
Uh,
Gautam.
Hi, sir. Sorry. Thank you, sir. I'll jump right into the questions. I'll start off with one of my own, and we'll take the other one. So there's this one line of argument, sort of regarding food security and production agriculture, that the problem that we face is more of a distributional one rather than the production, on the side of production. So they're going to argue against increasing productivity and things like that. So how would you respond to that line of argument?
No, you see, part of this thing comes from the fact that large stocks of grains are with the government. So people think that they produce more than enough. But in fact, the problem, if you look at the other side, if you look at per capita monthly consumer expenditure, and look at the amount of expenditure on food items, look at you also have physical data on food intake, right, from the National Sample Survey. And so if you actually look at the nutritional intake of households, as from the NSS, you will find a significant part of India's population is not meeting the calorie, protein, and micronutrient requirements at all under ICMR or whatever. Even calorie requirements are not being met in a significant proportion of the population. What is misleading is that if you take the per capita expenditure and use that cutoff line for poverty, then many households come above the poverty line. And the fact that there are stocks of grain in the government getting wasted and so on gives people the impression that production is not the problem for us. You see, this has always been a problem in India. Because, people keep saying Andhra Pradesh is a rice surplus state, a paddy surplus state. They used to wonder, is everybody in Andhra Pradesh well fed or what? Doesn't look like it. Not even in the movies. So it can't, it's just that people don't have money to buy. And whatever you have by way of a food security set up in India now was not the result of the largest of the ruling classes. It was, people will forget that there was significant pressure from the left and progressive forces, but there was also significant pressure from the judiciary. In fact, the whole move on the right to food, MDMS, and so on came from the Supreme Court, which wanted expansion of ICDS and MDM throughout the country, hot cooked meals. Then the question about National Food Security Act. So in a sense, if you look at the work that the right to food movement has been doing, for example, we're quite aware that the overall quantum of food grains production uh, is not necessarily adequate. In if things go wrong for a year or two, in a country like India, you need significant reserves given the insecurity of your annual food grain output. It is true that last few years we've done better and food grain output has increased somewhat faster. But between 1991 and 2007 at least, was a period of declining per capita food grains production availability. This is partly because of policy which set the prices too high, but later on the prices remained the same. And so there was improvement in consumption. But it is not as if India doesn't have a challenge of increasing food grains production to the extent required to meet the genuine medically or scientifically mandated levels of consumption of food grains or of food in general. Yeah, we certainly not in move from 50 to 55 million tons to 300 plus million tons is a very significant improvement, obviously, but over a long time, over a 60-year period. But if your population gets stabilized, and if this food grain gets distributed fairly equally, then certainly that would be less of a crisis. But what is this point about distribution? I mean, how does distribution occur? Is it a physical distribution or is it a question of purchasing power? So clearly, if we take, normally we talk about food security. I've done some work on this. I've done some two reports for Swaminathan Foundation and the UN, one on urban and one on rural insecurity. We look at three dimensions. We look at availability, look at access, and look at absorption. The availability of food grains per capita in a country can be calculated by looking at this year's net output, net of whatever you need for seed, feed, and wastage, net imports if you have any, and draw down from your existing stocks. If and this will give you total availability of food grain for a year. But this is availability, this is national level availability. There's no guarantee that you can reach it to wherever it is needed quickly, right? That is transport, infrastructure bottlenecks, all that is there. But even leaving that aside, let's assume that you solve the availability problem. What about access? How do people access food grains? Do they have the money to buy? Do they have the purchasing power? Do they have employment? See, obviously, this is a very straightforward matter. We can say quite easily that it's a matter of purchasing power. But how does a household access purchasing power? Either it must have its own productive assets from which it can generate incomes, or it must be able to obtain productive employment. Now, both are big challenges in India's economy. So, for the majority of the population, food security is far from a settled issue. Why are people so desperate to say that let the ration shops be open, give us grain in this pandemic also? So, the notion that people are generally food secure and, we're producing so much food that we shouldn't be stressing increase in output. And this comes from two different sources. One comes from a source that says that we shouldn't be producing food at all, but must be producing something else for the European market, the Ashok Gulati type of understanding. But the other thing comes from ecological, fundamentalists who think that by producing rice we are destroying the world, or methane or whatever argument you want to push. I'm not dismissing any of this, lightly. I respect the concerns behind this, but realistically, I don't think we can say we are in a position where we produce enough food and we have mechanisms to distribute it so that people don't go hungry. As people like Matheson and John Dress, who are certainly no radical leftists, as they keep insisting, a significant proportion of India's population is still food insecure. Chronic hunger characterizes our country, okay? It has not changed fundamentally. It may be true that you are now, better at meeting a part of the calorie requirement, but you still have proteins and micronutrients and so on. So, if you take food in a more comprehensive sense, you're very far from any kind of food security. But if you take it in the food grain sense, it's a very tenuous situation. I wouldn't be very complacent. And if neoliberal policies continue, there's no guaranteeing India's population's food security at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is from Ashika, who is asking, the IMF has conceded that wealth inequality is a major issue, and World Bank is stressing on the role of state in development. So, how do you make sense of this shift in rhetoric from?
Very good question. I mean, once it's proved that the emperor has no clothes, you have to admit that the emperor has no clothes. Right? Not much you can do about it. But let's find out what the IMF and the World Bank have to say. If the Joe Biden government pushing for, a 32% tax rate is not able to get the consent of the European Union. So we have a nice game where the European Union says, you want to do it, you go ahead. And would the US then consider doing it? See, this is the catch, with global finance capital dominant, the point that Professor Pravat Patnaik often makes. It will be very difficult for any individual country to address the issue of wealth inequality. And one country which can is America. IMF, World Bank making pious statements, even while they squeeze the developing countries. Why doesn't the IMF write off all its debts? Why doesn't the World Bank write off all its debts? I mean, all this very pious talk about inequality being bad. Very nice to hear it from them, but not very meaningful. Yes, you're very correct in saying you put it as rhetoric. It's important rhetoric because they find that it is difficult to sell the old story of trickle down. It's trickling up, not trickling down. It's flooding up, not trickling down. That's the problem they have. And we don't have to say it. They have their own people, Piketty and like was saying it. And then Piketty becomes the most radical economist of our time. I mean, there are interesting, phenomena around us, which we can look at. And with all due respect to the great economist, of course.
Yeah. Next is by Abid. Is asking, why has there been such a low rate of female labor force participation as per our official data sets? Is this an underestimation of women's work, or is it a structural drawback of our economy, or both?
Yeah. there's no doubt that a lot of the work women do doesn't get counted as work. Okay, so the labor force participation rate data do suffer. There have been attempts to revive it and to include the latest protocols and so on that come from discussions with the ILO and the world bodies concerned. But we still tend to underestimate, especially non-monetized work performed by women doesn't get counted easily. There are many significant issues. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical detail about this. But in addition, to the extent that the age composition of our population is also changing, and to the extent that care functions have been almost exclusively made the responsibility of women, I'm sure these are playing a role also in preventing women from entering, income earning economic activity away from their places of residence. If at all there's something they can do in the neighborhood while taking care of children or old people, that's a different matter. But remember, we are a country with hardly any social security system for older people, for differently abled people, or for children. And in this whole 2 year pandemic period, I mean, there's been an impossible thing, right? Children stay home. Worse, the husbands also stay home, which is quite a challenge in many cases. But seriously, I mean, I think Abid's question is very valid. We had a 2 day workshop, 3 day workshop in the FAS organized one in Kochi 2 years ago on female rural labor force participation and the kind of work they were doing. And there's some very good articles that came out in that volume. I don't remember offhand the points, but I think you should check with FAS and ISI in Bangalore. Professor Madhura was one of the key participants in that conference. We were all there. I don't remember right now the technical details of the discussion. But yes, the answer to your question is both. Both the definitional problems associated with defining productive work by women and the objective reality of women being pushed out of the labor force in the last couple of years especially. But if you take data from 18, 19, even that compared to what now you're getting from CMIE and so on, shows a further decline in female labor force participation. A very small part of it may be positive, indicating longer years of schooling for women, but that's a very, very small part. Bulk of it is basically women being either discouraged from joining the workforce or not being counted as part of the workforce when they're working because they are not seen as seeking and available for employment. So these are, technical issues.
Right. Next is regarding our recent farmer struggle. The question goes why could the recent farmers protest not gain the success or stature like the previous ones like the Baga, Telangana, Wali?
Well, it's happening in our midst that, when history is written, they will definitely be up there. Because, this has been a remarkable struggle. Because this is not even by you can't even say that this is triggered by the poorest of the poor, which is what you have with Tebaga, Telangana, or Warli, and so on. This is actually a struggle in which a much larger section of the peasantry and the cultivating population, including some rich peasants and maybe a handful of capitalist farmers, possibly, I don't know. But certainly a large number of middle peasants and some rich peasants are involved. And so the class character of the struggle is a bit more complex. What you can say is that given the huge negative impact of neoliberal policies on agriculture and farmers, and added to that the policies of the present government and its legislations, farmers see an existential threat. So even rich farmers are willing to join this struggle, and the fact that this has gone on for 7 months itself is testimony to its extraordinary nature. And just now in Tamil Nadu contingent is going over 1,000 odd people, likewise from other states. So I wouldn't conclude exactly what its position would be when we historically review this struggle. I think it's a remarkable struggle. I think in many ways this is unique because one, it's happening in regions where there has not been a great deal of peasant unrest on the scale that you mentioned in your question. Second, that this is occurring in the context of massive state repression. and yet has remained peaceful. And third, that for the first time, you have the emergence of unity of working class and the peasantry. Now joined by other mass organizations of youth and students and women and so on. So that kind of both different kinds of class organizations and some mass organizations coming together for sustaining a struggle of this kind is perhaps unique in the entire history of post-independence India. So I'm encouraged by that. I'm not saying that therefore it will succeed tomorrow. That we are dealing with a government where nothing matters to them except their egos. But we still, I think, the presence will finally make the government listen. Otherwise, the government will have to go. So, they will try all sorts of subterfuges. But yeah, I wouldn't, too early to say this won't. Oh, hello. Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I got disconnected. Am I okay now?
Yes, yes, you are. Yeah. The next question is from Saurav, asking, are agricultural reforms beneficial for the farmers? Will it empower the farmers of India? Will MSP play a major role in farmer empowerment? If yes, is it right to make MSP as a fundamental right?
Well, I know about fundamental rights and all that. There is legislation pending. There was private legislation brought in the parliament saying that this MSP, as per the National Farmers Commission recommendation, should be made into law. The state then mandated to purchase, uh, you know, produce at the mandated price. But there are a lot of problems on the ground in practice because the estimation of the costs of cultivation uh, for different crops, and then the ensuring of procurement immediately after harvest, uh, and the access to a procurement center or alternatively doorstep procurement in all sorts of locations. These are all big practical challenges, but is MSP important? I think it is very important. I think today, you see, whatever data we have from various surveys, including those done by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies in many parts of the country, show that a significant proportion of the small and marginal farmers do not make any positive income net of costs in crop cultivation. So there is a clear need for crop prices to be aligned to cost of cultivation so as to assure a certain guaranteed rate of return for the farmers. Now, why is it that incentivizing corporate capital is all right, but somehow incentivizing farmers is not? So I think there's a strong case for farmers to get the same treatment in principle, that their cost of cultivation will be covered, they'll be guaranteed a certain minimum profit. Now, in the case of, at least this is an employment intensive uh, industry or activity, in the case of the concessions you're giving to the corporate sector, you don't even have any estimate of the costs versus benefits in terms of employment or anything else. You just have an assumption that offering tax rate reductions will help increase investment, that will create employment. That whole narrative of the neoliberal reforms. So I would say yes. I would say MSP is important, but it's the simple answer is a problem because you've got so many different crops in India, and some of them are very much linked to the market, some of them are not, some of them are grown in specific sites, some are grown all over the place. If state governments can be financially empowered to provide minimum support prices for the crops that are important in their own region, then that you disaggregate the problem a bit. So, whatever legislation you bring in has to be sufficiently well specified and flexible to enable different regions to adapt it suitably. But yeah, I'm no legal expert, so I can't talk about whether law like that can be framed or not. But I think it's important. I think A good price for the produce is a very important incentive for the cultivator. But this is not the only problem in agriculture, right? I mean, this is good as far as it goes. But there are many other problems in agriculture, including that of the agricultural laborers or of poor activity in the countryside. People are hailing the increase in non-farm employment in the countryside, but it is not always a matter of joy. Sometimes it's a matter of distress that people are seeking non-farm employment. So, behind the question you asked, there are many other questions that are lurking. So, I'll stop there, I think.
Thank you, sir. Uh, the next one is from Gopika Lakshmi. In the context of the post-pandemic phase, will there be a boom in the service sector now that things are shifting to online and digital sort of things, work and things? So, do you think it will be even more important than it already is?
Yeah, I'm no expert on this, so I can't really, claim to give you a very, informed opinion on the specifics of the question. But think of it this way, um, whichever sector you're talking about, there has to be a boom. There has to be people buying things, right? So if purchasing power is not increasing rapidly. What this will do is it will of course help lower supply side constraints. Okay, correct. And if there's international demand, yes, that's what our IT enabled industry has survived on. But for domestic service sector, tourism and all that, people have to have money in their hands to go and do tourism, right? So it's likely, certainly, that they will pick up, no doubt about that. But how far and how sustainable will be a function of both the course of the pandemic and the overall macroeconomic policies, which provide, whether they provide for more purchasing power in the hands of people, whether they regenerate the economy. Yeah, service sector is relatively better position, but it goes both ways. You see, tourism is service sector, right? I mean, tourism is the one that has suffered the worst. Not because of lockdown. Even if you don't have lockdown, nobody's going to tour any country, right? So this is specific to the industry concerned. You can't say service sector in general. Those service sector activities do not entail much risk of infection and so on. They will pick up more quickly. But even tourism will eventually pick up once the uh, pandemic kind of becomes irrelevant to the overall equation. But even then, the basic question remains: what is the extent to which the population will have purchasing power to undertake all these activities? So, what is your framework, macroeconomic policy framework for providing employment and wages and other incomes? Those remain important. So it's not just service sector alone that decides it. The overall macro policies are important.
Right. I think we have a last question now. It's by Punya. Interesting one. What lessons can India learn from China and vice versa?
It's a big one. No, you see, I don't think we can take it on at this point in time. Maybe we'll save it for the end of the series of lectures.
Right.
That's one way of persuading Punya, even if that is not the person's real name, to stay with us.
Yeah, I think we are the no more questions. I think we can wrap up today. Yeah. Thank you, sir. I think thank you for the wonderful exposition. In fact, it's been quite useful. In we've not yet completed it, but still it throws a lot of light on making sense of a lot of things that we are currently experiencing. It's not something that's just come up, in
Yeah,
2014. That's something that a lot of people lose sight of. That like all of the issues just sprang up in 2014, and it just
yeah,
in some sense it's just a manifestation of the unsolved questions, and the not solving our agrarian question primarily, and its after effects and other policy shifts. But we have two more sessions coming up, which would cover more recent developments, which I'm sure will be much more interesting for a lot of people. And also we have a session of post 2014, how to make sense of post 2014 phase, which I'm sure might be even more interesting given that's the time we live in. So thank you, sir. We look forward to meeting you again next week. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming, and take care and stay safe. Good night.
Yeah, thank you.